This is the brief on the causes and mechanisms of inflation. We all hear about rising prices, but what's really going on behind the scenes? Well, it turns out inflation is way more than just extra money floating around. It's this whole ongoing process, a mix of money supply, shocks to our supply chains, and even just what we all expect to happen. Okay, first up, the main driver is something called demand pull. This is the classic story, too much money chasing too few goods. So when demand outstrips supply, prices jump. This usually happens when central banks pump a lot of cash and easy loans into the system. That link is absolutely critical. Second, the problem can also start on the supply side. We call this cost-push inflation. It's when the cost to make things goes up. Think raw materials. A prime example was the 70s energy crisis. A related shock is import prices. If your currency weakens, everything you import gets more expensive, and that can be nearly a third of what you buy. And finally, maybe the most powerful driver is just our expectations. If people think inflation is coming, they build it into contracts, like tying wages to the price index. So when the index rises, wages rise automatically, which pushes production costs up and creates a self-fulfilling spiral. By the way, the target for inflation is usually between 1% and 3%. So really, it's a constant tightrope walk, managing money, absorbing global shocks, and keeping public expectations stable, all to hit that target rate.
Okay, let's unpack this. So at its core, the definition of inflation is a continuous process of price increases.
And that word continuous is so important.
Why is that?
Because a one-time price shock, that's not inflation. It's the sustained rise that makes it a systemic issue. And what the sources we looked at show is that there isn't just one cause.
Right. People always want to find the single villain.
Exactly. But there are at least 4 distinct pathways, 4 different faces, if you will, that all lead to that same state of rising prices, and they often work together.
So let's break them down. Let's start with the classic drivers, the ones you learn in Econ 101.
Sure. Demand versus costs.
The first one is all about how much we're all trying to buy. It's called demand pull inflation.
Right. Or sometimes, more formally, the inflation of demands.
And the mechanism is, it's just basic scarcity, isn't it?
It is. It's when the demand for products and services is just way greater than the supply.
Like a bidding war.
Exactly like a bidding war. You know, if 100 people want to buy a new car, but the factory only made 50, well, the price is going to go up until 50 people drop out.
Well, where does that sudden, that extra demand come from? It's not like everyone just wakes up and decides to buy a new car all at once.
That's the real question. And the root cause is usually excess money in the market. Meaning central banks have been injecting currency into the economy. That could be through loans, printing cash, basically making it much easier for people and companies to borrow and spend.
So you have all this new money.
Chasing the same amount of stuff. The goods and services haven't increased, but the money has. Prices have to rise to soak it all up. It's almost an inevitability.
So the key takeaway here is that this kind of inflation, demand pull, often starts with central bank policy.
What's fascinating here is just how direct that link is. If you pump up the amount of money circulating without a matching increase in what the economy can actually produce, you're basically programming inflation into the system.
Okay, so that's one side of the coin. Too much money. What about the other classic driver?
That would be cost-push inflation. It comes from the complete opposite direction.
Not from the consumer, but from the producer.
Exactly. This is when inflation is caused by the rising price of raw materials. Think energy, commodities, key components, the basic inputs you need to make anything.
If it costs more to make a widget, the price of the widget has to go up.
It has to. Otherwise, the business just goes under.
And the textbook example of this is the energy crisis of the 1970s, right?
A perfect example. Oil prices shot through the roof, and suddenly it was more expensive to run a factory, ship goods, make plastics, everything. That cost gets pushed onto the consumer.
Which makes this kind of inflation really hard to fight.
It's much, much stickier than demand pull.
Wait, can you explain that?
Yeah.
If you have demand pull, you can raise interest rates, make money more expensive, and cool things down.
You can. But raising interest rates doesn't make oil any cheaper. It just means the company facing higher energy costs now also faces higher borrowing costs.
So you're actually adding pressure on them to raise prices.
It can be a real trap. The central bank's only tool is to crush demand, hoping that a slowing economy will eventually bring those input costs down. But in the short term, you can get the worst of both worlds, a recession and high prices.
Stagflation.
That classic stagflation scenario.
Okay, so we've got demand pull and cost push. Those seem to explain things inside a single country pretty well, but we don't live in that world anymore.
No, we live in a completely globalized economy. And that brings us to the third driver, which is all about international trade and the value of your money.
You're talking about import price inflation.
I am. And it's driven fundamentally by currency devaluation. If your country imports a lot of stuff and your currency gets weaker,
Everything you buy from other countries suddenly gets more expensive.
instantly.
This is where the U.S. data from the sources gets really eye-opening. For the average American family, if you look at their average consumption basket,
All the stuff they buy in a month.
right, a huge chunk of that is not made in the U.S.
It's a massive portion. The sources put it at around 30% imported products.
30%. So nearly a third of the average shopping cart is directly exposed to what the dollar is doing on the global market.
And if the dollar gets weaker, every single one of those items costs more in dollar terms, even if nothing changed at the factory where it was made.
It's just a pure currency conversion effect.
Purely. And the numbers here are stark. The sources point to a period in 2025 where the US dollar fell against a basket of other major currencies by about 12%.
12% is a huge drop. So what does that actually do to prices here at home?
Well, let's do the math. You have that 12% devaluation.
Okay.
And you apply it to the 30% of the shopping basket that's imported.
So 12% of 30%. That means the total cost of the basket goes up by 3.6%.
Exactly. A 3.6% price increase across the board just from the currency effect.
Wow.
And that 3.6% has nothing to do with domestic demand or local input costs. It's inflation that's essentially baked into the system from the outside.
So even if the central bank is doing everything right to control demand here, they're still fighting this 3.6% wave of inflation coming from abroad.
It makes their job incredibly difficult. Their tools are immediately less effective because a big part of the problem is happening outside their borders.
Okay, that's a powerful one. So we have excess money, expensive inputs, and a weak currency. What's the fourth and final driver?
The last one is maybe the most fascinating because it's psychological. It's all about human behavior.
Expectations inflation.
Precisely. The core idea here is that the simple expectation of future inflation can actually create real inflation today.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. If everyone believes prices are going to rise by 5% next year, they change their behavior now. And that change in behavior is what causes prices to rise.
How does that work in practice?
The most common way is through something called linkage mechanisms or indexation. Think about labor contracts that are tied to the price index.
So unions go into negotiations.
And they say, listen, we expect the cost of living to go up 5%, so we need a 5% raise right now to keep up.
And the company agrees. So now, before any of their own costs have actually gone up, they've just locked in a 5% increase to their biggest expense, labor.
Exactly. So what does the company do? They have to raise their prices by 5% to protect their margins. They're pricing in the wage hike that was based on an expectation of inflation.
And by doing that, they create the very inflation that everyone was expecting in the first place.
It's a vicious cycle. The price hike they just made confirms everyone's belief that inflation is high, which means the next round of wage negotiations will start from an even higher baseline.
It just spirals.
This raises an important question. Once those expectations become unanchored, once people stop believing the central bank can control prices, how do you stop the spiral?
It seems like you'd have to do something really drastic.
You do. It often takes a severe economic slowdown, a recession, to break that psychological loop and convince people that prices will stop rising so fast.
So those are the four engines: demand pull, cost push, imported inflation, and expectations.
Yeah.
Before we wrap, how is this all actually measured? How do we get that one single inflation number every month?
The measurement is obviously critical. It's done monthly in basically every country, and it all comes back to that idea of the average consumption basket.
The theoretical shopping cart.
Right. And it's compiled by the Central Bureau of Statistics. In the U.S., that's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They try to figure out what a typical family buys, from gas and groceries to rents and healthcare, and they track the total cost of that basket over time.
And the change in that cost is the inflation rate.
That's the CPI, yes. But it's a tricky process. People argue about what should be in the basket, how much weight to give each item.
Like if the price of steak goes up, people might just buy more chicken. The basket might not capture that substitution right away.
Precisely. It's an estimate, and it's always being refined.
Which leads to the question of what the goal is. Is the target just 0%? No price increases at all?
You'd think so, but no. 0% inflation is actually seen as dangerous.
Why?
because it's very close to deflation falling prices. And if prices are falling, nobody spends money. You just wait for things to get cheaper tomorrow. That grinds an economy to a halt.
So you need a little bit of inflation to keep the gears moving.
A little bit, yes. The desired and acceptable rate in most developed countries is somewhere in the range of 1% to 3% per year.
Just enough to encourage spending and investment, but not so much that it erodes everyone's savings.
That's the sweet spot they're always aiming for.
So what does this all mean? We've laid out these four faces of inflation: the pull from too much money, the push from high costs, the influence from global currency markets, and this tricky psychological spiral of expectations.
And the key thing to remember is that they're almost never acting alone. Right now, you could have elements of all four happening at the same time, which makes the job of a policymaker almost impossible.
It really lets you appreciate the complexity, and it helps you analyze what's happening right now.
It does. And that brings us to the final point from the research, which is a really specific forward-looking question.
A challenge for the listener to track.
Exactly. We talked about that $20-25 devaluation. We calculated it put about 3.6% of upward pressure on the U.S. consumption basket just from imports alone.
Right, that structural inflation that's baked in from abroad.
So the big question the sources leave us with is this. Will that built-in 3.6% pressure from imports be enough to prevent overall inflation from falling back to its target in 2026?
In other words, can the central bank's efforts to cool down domestic demand win against this powerful inflationary force coming from outside the country?
That's the economic battle to watch. And understanding these four mechanisms is really the only way to make sense of it.